Welcome to Blue Giraffe Finance. Today, let's talk about the financial history of Florida. Florida's history is at its core a financial story of indigenous trade, imperial subsidies, slave economies, speculative booms, devastating busts, and the long rise of tourism, agriculture, and real estate as the engines that made the peninsula rich and fragile. From pre-Columbian trade routes to 21st century housing bubbles, money has repeatedly redrawn Florida's map, reordered its society, and determined who could stay and who was forced to leave. Long before Spain, Florida was a mosaic of indigenous nations whose wealth was measured in food surpluses, trade goods, and sacred prestige items rather than coins or bank accounts. Cultures like the Calusa in southwest Florida, the Timucua in the north, and the Tequesta around present-day Miami managed complex economies based on fishing, hunting, and, in many areas, cultivated crops. Coastal groups, especially the Calusa, built power on control of fisheries, storing massive surpluses of shellfish and fish that could be redistributed as tribute and used to support large ceremonial centers. In northern Florida, Mississippian influence brought mound building and maize agriculture, linking communities into broad trade networks that moved stone, shells, copper, and other prestige goods across the southeast. Florida's waterways functioned as highways, supporting trade in salt, dried fish, shells, and crafted goods that tied the peninsula into wider pre-Columbian exchange systems. This indigenous economic landscape was not static or primitive. It was dynamic, regionally specialized, and tightly interwoven with spiritual and political life. Spanish arrival would shatter its demographic foundations. But many of Florida's later economic patterns, control of coasts, dependence on natural resources, and the importance of waterborne trade were already visible here. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon sailed into Florida, claiming the land for Spain, and setting off 2.5 centuries of imperial experiments that never quite turned a profit. For Spain, Florida was less an investment to be developed and more a strategic outpost to protect treasure fleets passing along the Atlantic coast from New World mines to Europe. After failed efforts at colonization in the 1500s, Spain finally established a permanent foothold in 1565 with St. Augustine, today the oldest continuously occupied European-founded settlement in the continental United States. St. Augustine's economy was fundamentally a subsidy economy. The settlement never produced enough to support itself and depended heavily on an annual royal subsidy, the situado, shipped from Mexico to pay soldiers and officials and buy supplies. To reduce dependence on costly imports, Spanish authorities tried to develop local production. Cattle ranching took hold in north-central Florida in the 1600s, with large free-range ranches supplying meat and hides to St. Augustine and even to Cuba. Missions established among native communities, over 100 across what is now Florida and coastal Georgia, were deeply economic institutions, funneling maize, labor, and other goods to the garrison town. Indigenous labor, often coerced, built fortifications, grew food, and provided transport, creating a fragile system in which Spanish Florida survived less through profit than through imperial necessity and indigenous tribute. As English and later French power grew in the southeast, Florida's strategic value rose even as its local economy remained weak. Raids, slave raiding, and warfare devastated mission populations and agriculture, undermining the very foundation of Spanish Florida's food and labor supply. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, Spain ceded Florida to Britain, and the peninsula briefly became a laboratory for a different economic vision. The British split the region into East and West Florida, brought in new settlers, and tried to turn the territory into a profitable plantation and resource colony. British authorities built better roads, expanded trade, and encouraged the cultivation of sugar cane, indigo, and fruit crops, especially in northeastern Florida. Lumber and naval stores, timber, tar, and resin for ships became export staples, integrating Florida more tightly into Atlantic mercantile networks than under Spain. A brisk trade in deerskins and other goods tied British Florida to native communities in the interior, mirroring patterns elsewhere in the southeast. Yet this promising mercantile economy was short-lived. After the American Revolution, Britain returned Florida to Spain in 1783, and many British planters, merchants, and their enslaved workers departed, stripping capital from the region almost overnight. Spain's second tenure in Florida was a time of geopolitical weakness, but intense economic change on the ground. American expansion pressed southward, and Florida became a refuge for people fleeing the plantation south, including runaway enslaved Africans and native groups, who would become known collectively as the Seminoles. Seminole communities developed their own trade-oriented economy, exchanging alligator hides, deer skins, and bird plumage with American traders for goods like cloth, guns, and tools. Trading posts such as those operated by Frank Stranahan in Fort Lauderdale and William Brown in Big Cypress became nodes linking Seminole producers with markets in the northern United States. At the same time, American planters eyed Florida's land as an opportunity for cotton and other plantation crops, setting the stage for conflict. The U.S. government's desire to secure this frontier, eliminate a refuge for runaways, and extend the slave economy southward drove military campaigns that would culminate in the transfer of Florida to the United States in 1821. Under American control, Florida's economy increasingly resembled that of the Deep South. Land speculation, slave-based agriculture, and the displacement of native peoples. American officials pushed treaties and military campaigns to force Seminole removal, clearing land for white settlement and cotton plantations, especially in Middle Florida around Tallahassee. Land itself became the primary asset, as surveys, sales, and grants turned indigenous homelands and Spanish land claims into parcels for speculation and development. Enslaved labor underwrote much of this growth, as planters invested in human property to raise cotton, sugar, and other cash crops for national and international markets. Even as agriculture expanded, Florida's economic base remained narrow and vulnerable. Limited infrastructure, recurring warfare with the Seminoles, and dependence on slave labor and a handful of commodities left the territory, and later statehood in 1845, exposed to shifts in prices and national politics. When Florida seceded and joined the Confederacy in 1861, it gambled its economic future on slavery and King Cotton. The war severely disrupted trade, destroyed capital, and led to emancipation, wiping out the financial underpinnings of the plantation system. Confederate Florida provided beef, salt, and other supplies to Confederate armies, but Union blockades and raids strangled external commerce. The end of slavery obliterated slaveholders' wealth on paper and forced a restructuring of labor through sharecropping, tenant farming, and wage work. In the Reconstruction years, Florida struggled with debt, political instability, and the challenge of rebuilding an economy no longer anchored by slave plantations. Railroads, timber, and small-scale farming began to emerge as new pillars, but capital was scarce, and much of the state remained sparsely settled. In the late 19th century, two forces transformed Florida's economic trajectory: railroads and the selling of sunshine. Investors like Henry Flagler on the East Coast and Henry Plant on the West built rail lines that connected Florida's interior and coast to the national network, slashing transport times and costs. Railroads opened vast tracts of land to development, enabling large-scale citrus and truck farming and turning small ports into booming towns. Hotels, resorts, and winter colonies sprang up along the new lines, especially on the Atlantic coast, marketing Florida as a healthful escape for wealthy northerners. Citrus and winter vegetables became major export crops, linking Florida farmers to northern markets and bringing cash and credit into previously isolated areas. At the same time, rail companies themselves profited from land grants and real estate schemes, embedding speculation into the very skeleton of Florida's growth. By the early 1900s, the dream of Florida shifted from plantations to an image of endless, developable land waiting to be turned into farms, towns, and resorts. State officials and private promoters championed drainage projects in the Everglades and elsewhere, promising to convert wetlands into rich farmland and house lots. Large-scale engineering works were justified as investments that would pay off through land sales, agricultural production, and increased tax bases. Advertising campaigns painted Florida as both a frontier and a paradise, drawing in settlers, tourists, and increasingly, speculators with cash to burn. These projects shifted public finances, as counties and state agencies floated bonds and took on debt to build roads, canals, and utilities, betting that rising land values would cover the costs. The stage was set for one of the defining financial dramas in Florida history, the 1920s land boom. In the mid-1920s, Florida became the epicenter of one of America's first great real estate bubbles, a speculative fever that would transform cities, spark a frenzy of construction, and end in spectacular collapse. National prosperity in the roaring 20s, cheap credit, and a belief in endlessly rising property values, combined with Florida's image as a subtropical Eden. Developers platted vast new subdivisions, often selling lots sight unseen to out-of-state buyers who flipped contracts for quick profits. Railroads strained under the demand to bring building materials and people into the state, and at one point imposed embargoes on non-essential freight headed for Florida. Cities like Miami, Tampa, and smaller planned communities saw explosive population growth as developers and municipal governments borrowed heavily to build roads, sewers, and other infrastructure meant to support the boom. Local governments issued large amounts of bonds, confident that future tax revenues from new construction and rising assessments would service the debt. But speculative manias eventually outrun reality. As land prices climbed to absurd levels and the supply of new investors dwindled, the market began to stall. The cost of living and construction rose, shipping bottlenecks worsened, and stories of scams and overhyped projects cooled enthusiasm. The end of Florida's 1920s boom came not just from financial gravity, but from catastrophe in the form of powerful hurricanes. In 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane tore through South Florida, causing an estimated $100 million in property damage at the time, equivalent to many billions in today's money, and destroying confidence in Florida real estate as a sure bet. The storm leveled buildings, wrecked infrastructure, and left many developers bankrupt, unable to complete projects or service debts. 2 years later, the Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928 caused further devastation, killing thousands and ravaging communities around Lake Okeechobee and Palm Beach County. Even after rail embargoes were lifted, the double blow of natural disasters and overbuilding extinguished the boom. Land values collapsed, buyers disappeared, and local governments found themselves with shrinking tax bases and enormous bond obligations they could not meet. Widespread unsecured bond defaults rippled through counties and cities, leading to lawsuits and long-term struggles over public debt. The state elected Governor Doyle Carlton in 1928, who sought to limit how much bonded debt local governments could take on, reflecting a painful lesson about over-leveraging public finances to chase private real estate dreams. Florida entered a depression of its own several years before the national crash of 1929, and some historians argue that the ripple effects of the Florida bust contributed to wider financial strains that culminated in the Great Depression. In any case, Florida's economy would not fully recover until after World War II, when a new wave of growth reshaped the state again. World War II and its aftermath brought military spending, infrastructure investment, and demographic shifts that launched Florida into its modern era as a fast-growing Sunbelt state. Military bases and wartime training facilities injected federal money and infrastructure into the state, laying groundwork for post-war industries and population influx. After the war, cheap air travel, interstate highways, and rising American incomes turned Florida into a mass tourism destination, no longer just for the rich. Retirees and migrants from other states and later from Latin America and the Caribbean poured into Florida's cities and new suburbs, driving demand for housing, services, and consumer goods. Agriculture remained important, especially citrus, sugar, and winter vegetables. But tourism and services increasingly dominated employment and revenue. Real estate development continued as a central economic engine, with cycles of subdivision, construction, and resort building reshaping coastlines and wetlands. This growth model, dependent on construction, tourism, and in-migration, brought prosperity but also vulnerability to recessions, hurricanes, and environmental damage. The financial crises of the late 20th and early 21st centuries would expose those weaknesses again, echoing the lessons of the 1920s. By the late 1900s, Florida's economy was fully plugged into national and global financial currents, meaning its fortunes rose and fell with broader trends in credit, real estate, and tourism. Developers, banks, and investors treated Florida property not just as shelter or local business, but as a financial asset class, bought and sold by individuals and institutions worldwide. Waves of condo construction and suburban expansion reflected cycles of low interest rates, easy credit, and optimistic expectations about continued population growth and tourism. The same dynamics that had driven the 1920s land boom, speculation, leverage, and the belief in ever-rising property values, reappeared in new forms in the mortgage and housing markets of the 2000s. When the national housing bubble burst around 2007 to 2008, Florida again found itself at the center of a bust. Home foreclosures, stalled developments, and collapsing property tax revenues strained local governments and families, while unemployment in construction and related sectors soared. Yet Florida's underlying attractions, climate, location, and image, continued to draw people and capital, setting the stage for recovery and renewed growth in the 2000s. As before, the state's economic resilience relied on its ability to repackage land, lifestyle, and leisure for new generations and new markets. Thanks for watching. For more great videos, please subscribe to the Blue Giraffe Finance YouTube channel.